So far in this series, we've talked about ownership from provider and user perspectives, and we brought them together through shared ownership. Now we arrive at the most practical concept of all: ownership boundaries. Because in the cloud, almost every misunderstanding, outage, security incident, or surprise bill happens at a boundary. Not inside a layer, but between layers. Let's start with a simple observation. Ownership is not continuous, it is segmented. There are edges where ownership ends and another begins. Those edges are ownership boundaries, and the cloud is built entirely out of them. An ownership boundary is the exact point where responsibility transfers from one party to another. On one side, the provider is accountable. On the other side, the user is accountable. There is no neutral zone. If something goes wrong, it always fails on one side of the boundary, even if it's not immediately obvious which. In traditional systems, ownership boundaries were often blurred. One team owned the hardware, the same team configured the software, the same team handled security. Failures were internal. In the cloud, boundaries are externalized and formalized. They are explicit and unavoidable. Let's visualize a simple boundary. A cloud provider owns the physical server. The user owns the operating system configuration. The boundary sits right between them. If the server's power supply fails, that is clearly provider-owned. If the OS is misconfigured, that is clearly user-owned. The boundary makes responsibility legible. Now here's where things get subtle. Not all boundaries are physical. Many cloud ownership boundaries are logical. For example, identity boundaries, network boundaries, service boundaries. You never touch them physically, but they define responsibility just as strongly. Consider identity and access management. The provider owns the identity system itself, authentication infrastructure, policy evaluation engines, but the user owns who gets access, what permissions they have, how policies are written. The boundary is sharp. If authentication fails globally, that's provider-owned. If the wrong person gets access, that's user-owned. Same system, different side of the boundary. Ownership boundaries also explain why cloud services feel opinionated. A managed service usually draws a boundary higher in the stack. The provider takes ownership of more layers. The user gives up control, but also responsibility. This is not magic, it's boundary relocation. For example, in a managed database, the provider owns patching, the provider owns failover, the provider owns engine maintenance, but the user still owns data modeling, access permissions, query efficiency. The boundary moves upward, but it never disappears. This is why cloud diagrams matter. Every box in a cloud architecture diagram represents an ownership region. Every arrow between boxes crosses a boundary. If you don't know which side of the arrow owns what, you don't understand the system yet. Ownership boundaries also define failure domains. When something fails, the first question is not what broke, it is which ownership boundary was crossed. Failures propagate differently depending on where boundaries sit. A provider-side failure affects many users. A user-side failure is isolated but often self-inflicted. This is why cloud debugging is fundamentally about boundary analysis. Experienced cloud engineers don't start with logs, they start with ownership. They ask, is this within our boundary, or beyond it? That single question cuts debugging time dramatically. Ownership boundaries also shape trust. You don't trust a cloud provider to understand your business logic, and they don't expect you to manage their data centers. Trust in the cloud is not personal, it's contractual. Boundaries define expectations. Now let's talk about one of the most dangerous assumptions: the assumption of implicit ownership. This happens when users believe, surely the provider handles this, or when providers assume, surely users understand that's their job. Every major cloud incident is traceable to this gap. Ownership boundaries must be explicit to be effective. This is why cloud documentation often feels repetitive. Providers repeatedly say, you are responsible for. They are not being defensive, they are drawing boundaries. Clear boundaries prevent ambiguity. Ambiguity creates failure. Let's step back. Why are ownership boundaries so central to cloud behavior? Because cloud computing is a system built by independent actors. The provider and the user optimize for different things. Boundaries allow both to move fast without stepping on each other. That separation is what makes scale possible. So here is the core insight. The cloud is not a single system. It is a negotiated interface between ownership domains. Everything you experience, performance, security, reliability, cost, emerges from how those boundaries are drawn and how well you operate within them. Let's summarize. Ownership boundaries define responsibility, determine failure behavior, shape cloud services, guide debugging and design. If you don't know where the boundaries are, the cloud feels unpredictable. Once you do, it becomes remarkably consistent.